Stanford University.
Okay, well, welcome to Lecture 7 of CS193P. This is winter of 2015. And today we are going to talk about multiple MVCs. All right, that includes split view controller, navigation controller. We talked about tab bar controller a little bit last time. We're also going to talk about segues, which is how we make all those multiple MVCs kind of transition to each other. And then I have a big demo that shows it all off. And after that demo, I'll come back. We'll talk about popovers, which are similar thing for having multiple MVCs, but are not quite the same. So that's why I've kind of segregated them off to the end. And then we'll have a demo about that. All right, so MVCs working together. These are the slides we saw at the end of last time. We're trying to build bigger apps by taking our MVCs and combining them with tab bar, split view, and navigation controller. We talked about tab bar controller, which is just simply 4 or 5 or however many MVCs all connected by just having these little tab bars at the bottom. It just picks which MVC you want to see. Each MVC, by the way, in a tab bar is completely independent. It runs on its own. It doesn't depend on the other ones. It actually might be kind of bad object-oriented programming, really, for them to depend on the other ones. So tab bar is for peers that aren't really talking to each other. They're just working together. They're related. Maybe they share a model and they're each editing a different part of the model or whatever. And then we talked about split view controller, which only has 2 MVCs in it, a master and a detail. We call the master and detail, by the way, because the master is usually the one determining what's in the detail. So the master is letting you view something, and then you're going to use the detail to see more detail about what you're doing in the master. Okay? So that's why we call it master and detail. So we're going to pick up now with navigation controller. So navigation controller is just yet another MVC whose view is multiple other MVCs, and navigation controller can handle any number of other MVCs. Okay? And it puts them on screen. It shares the screen instead of putting them side by side or putting them with the tabs. It puts them like a stack of cards. Okay? So navigation controller is basically stacking them like cards, and you can only see the one on top. That's how navigation controller shares the small screen space between multiple MVCs. So it's going to stack these MVCs up. So here's a navigation controller, and it's got an MVC in it. This is the all settings MVC from your device. If you go look on your iPhone or whatever, you'll see the settings app looks like this. So this is just an MVC that's kind of the top level, has all the settings accessible from here. Now the navigation controller is drawing only a little part of its view here, which is that title bar. The navigation controller will put the title there. You can have a couple of buttons up at the top, and the navigation controller draws that part. The rest of it is totally drawn, even underneath that title bar, totally drawn by whatever MVC is on top of this stack of cards. Okay, and right now, the only thing on our stack of cards is this all settings MVC. Now, even though the contents at the top are drawn by the navigation controller, what the contents are is determined by the MVC that's showing. Okay? And that's done with this UI view controller property called navigation item. So if you go look in the documentation for UI view controller, you'll see this property navigation item. If you click through to the type UI navigation item, you'll see that it's got a lot of properties in there like left button, right button, title, things like that. So the way the navigation controller figures out what to put in the top bar is it asks whatever MVC is on top of the stack. So as you go to different MVCs being on this stack of cards, that thing at the top will change. Okay? So let's say I click on general here because I want to see general settings. Okay? So I click on it and a new MVC gets put on top of the stack of cards. So now I can't see the other one. Okay? This new one is overlaying it, and this is just a general settings MVC. Completely different MVC, completely independent of the other one, working on its own. By the way, I didn't have a good screenshot of this, unfortunately, but it's also possible for the navigation controller to draw some buttons along the bottom there, a little small sliver on the bottom, and it gets those button items to put there by asking the MVC that's on top of the stack of cards for the toolbar items property. So if you look at toolbar items, it's just an array of these bar buttons. And so any MVC that returns anything in that array, when it's in a navigation controller like this, those buttons will appear at the bottom. So those would change each time you go to the next thing on the stack as well. So let's go ahead and click on something here. let's click on, oh sorry, the back button. Yeah, you see there's a back button in the upper left. The back button says throw the top card off. That's basically what back means. Throw the top card on this stack of MVCs that we're building, throw it off. And then I'm going to go back to where I was before. So that's how back works. It just throws it off. And when it throws it off, it completely throws it off. It disappears. Completely gone. All right? Out of the heap. Okay? All right. So let's put another card on the stack. So I'm going to click on accessibility here. Another card's going to slide in. I'm trying to simulate the animation of it, but it's kind of in Keynote, I can't exactly do it, but it slides in from the side. And this is yet another completely different MVC, the accessibility MVC. And we could pick something out of here, like I'm going to pick larger text right there, and another MVC is going to slide in. So we have 4 MVCs, totally different MVCs, on our stack of cards right here. And the one on top, which is the last one I chose, this larger text MVC, is showing. Okay, the rest of them are there, they just we can't see them because they're underneath this top card. Okay, so now let's do the back button. So I'm going to click this back button in the upper left, and when I do, it takes that larger text one off, throws it out, and now we've got the accessibility card, which is now this top of our stack, which only has 3 things on it. And we could do back again, goes back to the general one. We do back again, it goes back to the very top. Of course, once we get back to the very top, there's no more back button because this is the only card on the stack. Okay, so everyone understand what a navigation controller is? It's just a stack of MVCs. All right, but it's just like split view controller or UI tab bar controller in that it is showing multiple MVCs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how navigation controller works internally so you can get a feel for it. And I'm going to try and mix it with our MVC image that we had so you can kind of combine the 2 concepts in your mind. So let's say I had an MVC, this one up here, the purple MVC thing, and I had more features I wanted to put on there, but there's just not enough room on the screen anymore. I've kind of maxed out, or it just, those features don't logically make sense to be in the same place. Well, what I would do is create another MVC to manage those other features that won't fit. Okay? And so now, though, I need a way to have those 2 MVCs share the screen, and I could use a split view controller or maybe a tab bar controller if they were peers, or I could use a navigation controller. So let's see what it would look like to use a navigation controller to have these 2 MVCs, which they're related, share the screen. So a navigation controller is just an MVC. Okay? It's a controller of an MVC, and its view is a little rectangular area that usually fills the entire screen or a portion of the screen. And it's got the title. But it's a special MVC in that it's got an outlet called root view controller that points to an MVC. Okay, points to the controller of an MVC. And when it is pointing to that, then the navigation controller puts that MVC's view, okay, its view property, right? We know that UI view controller has this very important property called view, which is its top level of its view. It puts that on the screen underneath this title thing. So it fills the entire rectangular area, and then the title kind of overlaps it transparently, semi-lucent transparency. Okay, so that's great. So we got it in there. Now, how do we get the other MVC on? Well, when a UI element inside the view of this MVC, like a button or something like that, is pressed, then it can cause another MVC to get created. You notice that that MVC just appeared. It wasn't there before. But as soon as the button gets pressed in this guy's view, this MVC's view, that thing gets created. And that's something important to notice, that we're always going to be creating a new MVC when we do these transitions. Okay? Transitioning to a new card in a split view, we do something in the master that changes the detail. That's always creating a new, even the first time we press a tab bar, but only the first time for the tab bar, it creates a new MVC. Okay? So it creates this new MVC, and then the navigation controller just moves over to put that MVC's view on top. Right? And then, of course, you got the back button. When you click the back button, it goes back to the first MVC, and look what happens to that MVC. Gone. Okay? That's not hidden or something, it's just gone. It got deallocated probably from the heap. Okay, and then we're back to here. Okay, so that's how a navigation controller works. Very simple, and you know, split view and tab bar are similar kind of mechanism. Okay, so how do we get at these sub-MVCs? So let's say I had a split view controller or a navigation controller or a tab bar controller. How do I get at the things on the stack of cards or the 2 things, the master and detail? And the answer is they all have a property called view controllers. And it's an array of view controller. Okay? And that it's all the view controllers in its system. So in a split view, there'll be only two in there, the master and the detail. In a tab bar, there'll be however many tabs there are. In a navigation controller, there'll be however many cards are on the stack. That's how many things will be in that array. And it's settable too, which is a little weird. We don't usually set these things, but you can do it. So yeah, the way we usually set it is we're going to do it in the storyboards. Or navigation controller, for example, has methods like push and pop view controller that will push a view controller onto the stack. But that's doing that in code, and we're usually doing all this stuff in storyboards. So that's how you get at the sub things of these three kinds of view controllers. What about how do I get a hold of the view controller? Okay, how do I get that navigation controller? Well, how do I get a pointer to it or whatever? Well, it turns out every view controller knows if it's inside a navigation controller, or if it's inside a split view controller, or if it's inside a tab bar controller. It knows. And so UI view controller has these three properties: tab bar controller, split view controller, navigation controller, and they will return to you the split view controller that the view controller is in. Okay? If it's in one. If it's not, then it returns nil. And notice some view controllers might be inside a navigation controller, inside a split view controller. So more than one of these can be non-nil at a time, because we can nest these things to build more powerful user interfaces. So let's just use an example. If I'm the master in a split view and I want to get the detail, well, I can get the split view controller I'm in by saying split view controller. I'll put the little question mark there. That's optional chaining. If it's nil, then I'm obviously not going to get my detail. And then I'm going to say view controller sub 1, because we know that view controller sub 1 in a split view controller is the detail. So now I've got the detail. I can talk to it. I could, it's my detail, so presumably I might want to tell it to do things, display things, or whatever. Okay? So that's how we get at these things in code if we need to. But we often don't need to, because we can manage most of this in the storyboard. And so how do we wire this up? How do we create this relationship between these split view, tab bar, and navigation controller and all these sub MVCs? And it can be done in code, okay? But we're going to do it in storyboards in this class all the time. Okay? And we're just going to use control drag to do it. So let's see what that looks like. I'll do it for split view controller. We're just going to go to the utilities area, the same place we drag out a button or something like that. We're going to drag out a split view controller. Now, when it comes out, it's going to come out with a whole bunch of other MVCs pre-attached to it in an attempt to help you. But usually you're just going to delete those so that all you have left is the split view controller itself. Okay? And then you're going to control drag from the split view controller to the master and control drag from the split view controller to the detail. And that's how you can do the wire. So this is what it looks like. Here I have a storyboard. I've dragged out a split view controller. That's that gray thing on the left. Okay? I deleted all the things it was attached to, so I just had that. Then I control drag to, in this case, my master, which is my calculator. When I do that, it's going to put up this little thing that says, okay, what kind of connection do you want to make? And you're going to pick master view controller there. And that's going to make like a little connection to it. And then I'm going to control drag down to my detail, which is going to be the right side of my split view. And here I'm going to choose I want detail view controller. Okay? And then I'm going to have this, fully hooked up split view, and that's it. So it's very easy to hook these things up. All right? And tab bar, you can hook up exactly the same way. Connect as many of them as you want. Okay? Navigation controller is going to be done a little bit differently, which we'll see in a second. Okay? But there's a problem here, which is that a split view can't display side by side on an iPhone, or at least not anything but an iPhone 6 Plus. That's the only one big enough to really display side by side. So a split view really can't work on an iPhone. Okay? So the way we handle this is that iOS adapts its user interface to whatever device it happens to be on, depending on how its size class is. We'll talk about size classes later. But if it's kind of compact, like a phone, then it can't show it in a split view. So how can I show it then? If I have a master and a detail and I want to show it on an iPhone, the way I show it is with a navigation controller. So instead of having master and detail on the screen at the same time, on an iPad, on the phone, when I click in the master, it's the same button that I clicked to make the detail show it in split view, but when I click in the master on an iPhone, it's going to slide the detail on as a card on the deck. Right, on the navigation card stack. Now, the thing is, though, we want to build one storyboard that'll work for both platforms and automatically adapts. So how do we do that? We're just going to wrap our master in a navigation controller. So here is a navigation controller, which is my master. It's the calculator, right? And you can see it's hooked up to the split view already. And I'm just going to select it, and then I'm going to go to the editor menu and pick Embed in Navigation Controller. See that embed? And this is what's going to happen. Okay, the navigation controller is going to be interposed between the split view and the master. So now the master is in a navigation controller. Now, if I'm on an iPhone and I click in something that would change the detail, then it's going to push it on that navigation controller on top of the stack. But if I'm on an iPad, it's going to show them side by side. So this structure that you see right here, split view, navigation controller for the master, and then detail, this is a very common, a universal way of specifying your UI so it works on both. Okay? Now, we could also put the detail inside a navigation controller too. Why would we want to do that? Well, the only reason we would want to do that is because maybe we want the navigation controller's feature of a title, right? Or little buttons we want to put at the top. It's really nice for that. But we don't need a navigation controller down there for navigation because we are never navigating from the detail. We only navigate to the detail. So it doesn't itself need to be in its own navigation controller. And we'll see that in the demo. All right, so that's how we wire these things up. Okay, they end up looking like that. Now, how do we make these things appear? How do we make changes in our master that cause something to appear in the detail? Or if we have a navigation controller that has multiple cards, when we clicked all those buttons and another card kept coming on in the stack, how did we do that? Okay, and the answer is we use segues. Okay, so segues is how these things transition from view controller to view controller. There's really 4 kinds of segues. They're custom segues too, but we're not going to talk about that in this class. It's kind of advanced. You almost never need those. So there's 4 basic segues. There's show segue, okay, which basically shows the MVC that you're talking about. And if you're in a navigation controller, it will show it. It'll put it on top of the stack of cards. If you're not in a navigation controller, then it will show it modally. Okay, so now modal presentation of an MVC, we haven't talked about that with all these other things, but basically it just takes over the entire screen. Okay, just completely takes over the entire screen, puts the MVC that you want to show on screen. So it's very kind of disruptive to the user a little bit because their app is stuck. It can only do what this MVC is asking them to do. So I kind of recommend against using modal and trying to keep your apps from doing that. So if you're using a show segue, you probably want to be in a navigation controller so that it will slide it on deck. Because then the user can always go back. If they didn't mean that, they can go back. Then there's show detail segue, very similar to show. The only difference with show detail is that if you happen to be in a split view controller, it will show this MVC as the detail. Okay? Otherwise, if you're in a navigation controller but not in a split view controller, it just pushes it on the stack just like a show would. Okay? So show detail, tiny difference there. It's just about split view. So it really helps you when you're in a split view decide whether what you want is the master to, if the master's in a navigation controller, do you want that to slide on the master, the thing you're segueing to, or do you want to appear in the detail? Okay? Then there's modal, which forces this full screen takeover type of thing. I'm not even going to talk about that because I'll talk about it later in the quarter, but I don't want to talk about it early because it can be used as a crutch to build UIs. You really want to be using navigation controllers and split view controllers to do that. And then there's popover segue. Now, popover segue pops the view controller that you're segueing to up in a little window that's on top of everything else, but just a little window instead of taking over the whole screen. But it really is taking over the whole screen because the user can only interact with what's in the little popover window. If they click anywhere else, it dismisses the popover window. But what makes popover nicer than just modal is that since it doesn't take over the whole screen, you can still kind of see grayed out where you came from. And if you click where you came from, it puts the popover away. So the popover has very easy to cancel. It's very easy for users to get back to where they were if they didn't really mean to click that. Okay, so that's popover. So we'll talk over popovers at the end. Again, I want to emphasize what I just talked about on the previous slide. Segues of all kinds, no matter what you're doing, show detail, modal, or popover, they always create a new MVC. You're never segueing to an existing MVC anywhere. You're always creating a new one, always. That's what segues do. Okay, that takes a little bit of getting used to in your mind. Because of course you see this stack of cards, navigation 1, and you press back, and then you click to go back to where you were, and you think you're going back to the same one, but you're not, because as soon as that thing comes off the stack, it's gone. Even in a split view, you click in the master, it updates your detail. You click again in the master to update the detail, and the detail changes, and you think, oh, that was the same thing, it just got changed. No, the previous one got thrown away, and a new detail got created. Okay? So segues always create a new MVC. All right, so how do we make these segues happen? Okay, you can do this in code as well, and I am going to show briefly how you do this in code. But 90% of the time, you're going to do it in a storyboard with control drag, okay, which is how we create most of the things we do in iOS. So here's an example of doing it with the control drag. I'm control dragging from a button in my calculator. So I added a button. The icon is very, very small, but it actually looks like a little graph. So I'm control dragging from that in the upper right corner there down to the detail. Because I want, when that button's pressed, I want the detail to be replaced with a new graphing MVC. Okay? When I let go of that, it's going to say, what kind of segue do you want? This little black box is going to appear. And here I'm going to pick show detail, because if I'm in a split view, I want it to replace the detail. If I was in a navigation controller only, I probably still would choose show detail, because that also pushes on the stack. But if I were the master in a split view and I didn't want it to do the detail, I wanted it to actually slide on the stack of the master, because the master could be a stack, then I would use show. All right? I could also make it a popover or a modal here. So I'm going to pick show detail. That's what I want. And it's going to make a line appear in the storyboard. And in the middle of the line is a little round circle. If you click on that and bring up the attributes inspector on the right, you'll see that there's a little pop-up that says what kind of segue you want. We already chose this one to be show detail. And there's also a critical field there called identifier. And that's a unique identifier for this segue. And you need this identifier. And let's talk about why we need this identifier. So I'm going to call the identifier for this one show graph. And you should usually call the segue something that is probably a verb phrase that says what this segue does. So this segue, when you press on the button, it shows a graph. So I'm going to call it show graph. Okay? So I just typed that in there. So I told you before that everything in the storyboard is linked up with what's in your code by name. Whether it's the class of the view controller, class of a UI view, name of an outlet, name of an action, name of a segue, which is basically what the identifier of a segue is. They're all just names, and we have to make the names the same in our code. So it's a loose coupling to make those two things work together. So we'll have to reference this name in our code. Okay, so where are we going to use that identifier? Well, one way we can do it, only the 10% case I said, is to cause a segue to happen from code. And you do that with the UI view controller method, perform segue with identifier. And you just specify that identifier, and it's going to make that segue happen. Okay? Simple as that. That's all I'm going to talk about this one, because you're not going to be doing this one probably in this class. Maybe in your final project you might find a reason to do it. But the number one reason to have the identifier in there, and the main thing that it's used for, is to prepare a segue. Because when that segue happens, it creates a new MVC. That new MVC was just born. It needs to be prepared to do what it wants to do. So for example, in the calculator case, when I segue to a graphing MVC, it's just a blank graphing MVC. I have to tell it what to graph. I have to prepare it, basically. Okay? So that's the number one thing, is preparing. So how does preparing work? Preparing, very simple. The MVC that contains the instigator of this segue, like the button or whatever's causing it to segue, that MVC implements a method called prepare for segue, and inside it gets the MVC that was just created, and it has to prepare it. So let's talk about what that code looks like. Prepare for segue. It takes two arguments. Okay, the first one is the segue. That's a UI storyboard segue instance, and it really has two important things in there. One is the identifier, so you know which segue you're preparing, and two is the MVC that it just created that you're going to segue to, which is called the destination view controller. It has a second argument there, which is sender. That's just the UI button or whatever that caused the segue to happen. You don't usually need to look at that, but sometimes we'll see later in the quarter when we want to look at that. But that's all it is. It's just what object caused this segue to happen. So we're going to look at that segue identifier. It's just a property, segue identifier. It could be nil, because you might not have set it. And so you want to check if it's nil here. So here I'm doing if let to check if that thing's nil. Then I'm just going to switch on it, okay? And I'm going to look for show graph, okay? And once I know that I'm preparing for show graph, then I can say, okay, give me the MVC, that graphing calculator MVC that you just made. Now, the thing is, segue.destinationViewController, that property is any object. Okay, so you have to use as to turn it into the right class of the MVC you just created. Now, in the case here, I created a calculator graph view controller. I've abbreviated here calc graph view controller, although you shouldn't do that in your homework. Okay, it's just that it wouldn't fit on the slide here. So calculator graph view controller. So I'm turning that destination view controller into a calculator graph view controller. And if I can't do it, well, then I can't prepare it. So that's why I'm doing if let there. So if I can, then I'm just going to call methods and set properties in that calculator graph view controller that are needed to prepare that thing to come on screen. Okay? So again, in this case, I would probably tell it what I wanted it to graph here. Okay? Maybe I would set its color or something else, the scale, or I don't know, whatever we wanted to set here, we could do. Okay? Now, I don't put a lot of red on my slides. And when I do, you really should pay attention, okay? Very important thing to understand is when you are preparing that newly created MVC, its outlets have not been set. Remember, outlets are these implicitly unwrapped optionals. We're always kind of expecting them to have been set. Well, this is one case where that's not true. When you're preparing your MVC, its outlets are not yet set, okay? That can cause crashers. That can cause you to unexpected behavior because you set something in preparing it and you're expecting something in the view to have been set, but it didn't happen because the outlet is just not set yet. So you have to take whatever the preparation is and hold on to it, and then later on, when the outlet does get set, maybe in the property observer of that outlet, you can load up the information that you were prepared with here. Okay? I'll see that in the demo. I've made my demo intentionally crash because of this. And we'll go back and look at why that happens. Okay, but this is red. Pay attention. You know, if your segue doesn't work the first time, it might well be because you're expecting outlets to be set when your MVC is being prepared. Okay? So that's preparing for segue. You can also prevent a segue from happening. If there's some reason it doesn't make sense for that segue to happen, you could just disable the button. But if you didn't want to disable the button, you could click the button. And what will happen here is your UI view controller will be asked, should I perform this segue with identifier? And it'll pass you the identifier and the sender. And you can just return false. And then it won't do that segue. It won't crash or anything. It just, you touch the button, does nothing. Okay, so you can control your segues kind of programmatically as well like that. Okay, so demo time here. We're going to demonstrate all of this. And I'm going to do this demonstration by creating a completely new application called Psychologist. Okay, so let's go over here. So I'm going to Xcode. And here's happiness and calculator. But I'm going to create a new project here. I'm going to call it Psychologist. Psychologist. Okay, and it's going to create, I'm going to put it in the same place that my calculator and happiness apps were. Here it is. I'm going to move these things out of the way like we always do, the images, assets, the launch screen, so that I just have my main storyboard here and this view controller. And I'm actually going to rename this view controller. I don't like the name generic view controller. I even had you change it in the latest homework assignment because I just don't think that's a very descriptive name. So I'm going to change the name of my view controller here to be Psychologist View Controller. So I have to do that in 3 different places again. So here I'm going to say Psychologist. Okay. Here I'm going to change the name of the file to be Psychologist. That's surprisingly hard to type, by the way. And then in the storyboard, of course, I need to go to the identity inspector here and change it to be a Psychologist View Controller. Okay, so I always have those 3 steps. So now I have this Psychologist View Controller. What's this psychologist going to do? Well, he's going to ask you a question like psychologists are wont to do, and you're going to give an answer, and then he's going to make a diagnosis, okay, based on your answer as to how happy you are or not. And then it's going to use the happiness view controller to show how happy you are, show the diagnosis basically. Okay? So we're going to use both the psychologist view controller and the happiness view controller from our last app. But let's start with this psychologist view controller here. Let's build its UI. He's going to ask a question, so I'm going to bring out a label for the question here. And he's going to ask the question, what do you see in your dreams? That sounds like a very psychologist-y kind of question. And let's make it bigger font, maybe like 36 point or something like that. We can make it, larger here. Let's center it, make this text centered. Let's try and put it in a nice place. Okay, let's use our blue lines to put it somewhere here. Let's put it like that, so it's nice. And put in a good place. Let's try, I'm going to show you a little bit of auto layout every lecture, just to show you kind of the things you can do. So let's try and see if we put this all in blue lines up here, right? So let's see if we can request or have it reset to suggested constraints and see if it'll work, okay? So here this is for the selected view. So I'm select this view. I'm going to go reset to suggested constraints. Now let's see what happened. Now this doesn't look good. I don't like this because I really don't want this thing attached to the bottom. But the real place, a good place to look for the constraints is over here again in Size Inspector. If you look down at the bottom, you can see all the constraints that reset to suggested constraints did. And I like this one, and I like that one, and I like that one, but I don't like that one. So I can just click on it and hit delete and get rid of that. Now as soon as I did that, of course I got the yellow because it's misplaced. So I'm going to go back and do what we did all the way back in lecture 1, which is I'm going to update this frame, fix the misplacement, no issues. Boom, I got this where I wanted. Okay, so that's another way to use auto layout there. All right, so let's get the answers out. Here's our question. Let's grab our answers out here. So maybe I see a dancing tree. Okay, if I see a dancing tree in my green, let's make the font bigger again on this one too. If I see a dancing tree in my dreams, I'm probably going to be pretty happy, I think. So let's try and put this one where it should be. So I'm going to try and put this one right in the center of my view. So again, let's try and reset to suggested constraints and see if that works. Okay, well that looks bad too. So let's go look over and see what it did. All right, well, it aligned center to a super view. That looks good. But it aligned X up with this thing up here. And I don't really want that, so I'm going to delete that. The bottom space, I definitely don't want that. And it fixed the width. I definitely don't want the width fixed. I want the width to match whatever the size of this thing is. So kind of got most things here, but I really don't have a vertical position or a horizontal position of this thing set. So I'm going to use another one down here. This is the alignment one. And I'm going to go down here and say I want the alignment, the horizontal and vertical centers to be lined up. So I really already got the vertical center right there. So I just do horizontal center. So I'll add that constraint. So now I've got these two things lined up. That looks like what I want. Again, it's a little off this placement. Probably the size is not quite right. We'll put that right. And boom, now we've got this tree in the middle. Okay? So let's add some more answers. I'm just going to copy and paste because I like this font combination. Let's say you dream of a dirty gold, no, not dirty. We'll just say a golden bear. Okay, so let's say a golden bear somehow shows up in your dreams. Doesn't sound very good. So there's that. And this one, let's see if we can do suggested constraints with this one. Okay, we do that. Now, oh, this one looks good. It's got the bottom space and the center. Looks good. Okay, so we're rocking with that one. No need to do anything. Let's do another one. Buckeye, I'm not even sure what that is, but we'll put that in there. We'll reset suggested constraints for this one too. Make sure that looks good. Yes, it does. Okay, this is just the size inspector right here. Right? All right, so that's good. So let's run our app and see how it looks. Okay, here we go. Oh, that doesn't look good. What do you see is getting cut off? Let's see if we rotate. So it's good in landscape. It doesn't look very good in portrait. So why is that happening right there? Some of you found this out in your homework. It's because right now we have this thing set to be of a fixed size. The font size right here, see auto shrink, fixed font size. And that doesn't need to be fixed. I'm happy if that's any size. I really don't want it to be any smaller than like 12 point. That's getting pretty small in a UI. So I'm going to set the minimum size to 12. And now when we run, it'll make the font smaller to fit the size. But if we go to a larger, it'll make the font bigger. OK? Question back there. So the question is there any way to make this text wrap to the next line? And there is. There's a couple of ways to do it. There's UI text view, which is a very powerful text wrapping one. But even label, you can go here to the label, and when you inspect it, you can say how you want the line breaks to happen. You see here it says truncate tail. And you can also control how many lines long you're going to allow the label to be. OK, so now we have this good UI. And we want to make it so that it works with our happiness view controller. So we need our happiness view controller. So how are we going to get our happiness view controller? And the answer is we're just going to copy and paste it from our other app. So let's go open our other app. OK, where is it? It's here, developer, happiness. So I'm just going to open happiness in Xcode. Here it is. And I'm just going to, first of all, copy the code over. So I have my face view and my happiness view controller. I'm just going to drag them from one into the other. Okay, just drag them from one project into the other. When you do, it'll allow you to copy them if you want, or you could have a reference. If you're going to have a reference, make sure that that place you're referencing to stays around, that you're not deleting it and things like that. Or you could have it copy. I'm going to have it copy the items right here. Okay, so copy those two things in. And then what about my storyboard here? I need to kind of get this happiness view controller over here, okay, over into this guy. Okay, well, I can copy and paste that too. I just select this thing, copy, go over to here, and paste. Okay, so now I have somewhere my two view controllers. Okay, now one thing I notice when you do copy and paste, it doesn't draw the face. It seems like it needs kind of a little bit of a kick, a little boost before it'll do that. So like if you go to face view and just edit this file and hit save, it seems like that gives it the kick in the head, literally, that it needs to draw the head. Okay, so now we have this. So we've got our two view controllers here, and we want to put them in a split view so that this is the master and this is the detail. So let's do that. Super simple. We're going to go down here, go grab a split view controller. Okay, split view controller is right here. See, here's tab bar controller. Here's navigation controller somewhere, page view controller even. We're not going to talk about that, but that's another way to combine MVCs. But let's drag this split view controller out. Now see how it comes with other stuff that you don't want? So when you drop it in there, literally just select the stuff you don't want and delete it. Okay, don't want any of that stuff. Trying to be helpful. And so here's my split view controller. Okay, and here's my master and detail. I'm just going to control drag to set my master. So here's the master. And I'm going to control drag to set the detail. Okay, that's it. So let's run. Let's actually go run on an iPad. See what this looks like. All right, so here's an iPad. Oh, I thought I was going to get a split view with this thing. How come I don't get a split view? What? Yes, exactly. Very good job. You should get extra credit or something up there. Yeah, the problem is this UI comes in through this arrow. So it comes to here. So it's bypassing the split view. It's not even going to the split view. So this is a common mistake you'll do. You'll forget to move this. And you can just pick this arrow up and move it over here. Okay? Now when we run, it's going to come in via the split view. And it is a split view. If I slide out from the left, there's my master. And here's my detail. Okay? And if I rotate, okay, I get the master and detail on the screen at the same time. Sound good? Now, clicking this doesn't seem to do anything. Okay? So we're going to have to fix that. And let's go look at it on an iPhone, see what it looks like there. Oh, that didn't hit play, sorry. All right, here's my iPhone. Okay, I got, oh, wait, how do I, oh, I can't see the face. Okay, let's try landscape. Oh, that doesn't work either. So there's no way to get at the face. right now. There's absolutely no way to get the face. And why is that? Well, that's because, again, on phone, which is a compact size trait device, split view doesn't put things side by side. It just doesn't do that. Okay, now if we go iPhone 6 Plus, try that one. It's kind of a hybrid. First of all, it's such high resolution that even the small version, this is the smallest I can get it. But see, in portrait, I have the same problem as another iPhone. There's no way for me to get to the face, because there's no way to, if I try sliding out from the side, nothing happens. Okay, because in portrait mode, the iPhone 6 Plus works like an iPhone. But in landscape, on iPhone 6 Plus, it's big enough that it can actually show them both. Okay, so that's kind of cool. All right, but it still doesn't work. Okay, and so why does this not work? Well, it doesn't work because we have no segues. We don't describe, how to get from one of these things to another. So let's put some segues in. What we're going to do, well, actually, before we do the segues, let's fix this problem with the iPhone not working. Okay, let's fix the problem where we can't see the iPhone. And then we're going to fix that, what we talked about in the slides, by putting this guy in a navigation controller. Okay, so let's go do that. We're going to do that with embed in navigation controller. It puts it in a navigation controller. Okay, now when we run on the iPhone, we'll just run on a normal iPhone. You'll see that we get the face. Okay, awesome. And we can go back to the master, and there's no way to get back to the detail. Okay, so now we definitely need those segues. We need these buttons to cause a segue to happen to the detail. Okay, so that's what we're going to do next. And actually, let's take a second here and show what this looks like on the iPad. We added the navigation controller here. Let's see what effect it had on the iPad. And the answer is that the master now has a title. See? Has a title there. And this is kind of would be nice even to put a title in here. So we can go over here and actually double click on here and put in psychologist. Put a title in there. Notice, look what happened to our question. It kind of got obscured. You see that? By this title. And actually, we have a warning up here. You see that warning? That warning is about that. Let's click on it. It says, the frame for what do you see in your dreams will be different at runtime. That's because it's going to automatically move it down underneath this. And we can make that happen in our storyboard by going over to here, clicking here, doing what we always do when we have a problem with our auto layout, fix our misplacement, and it'll move it back down. Okay? All right, so this is looking good. So let's get this segue business happening. So I told you the segues are done just with control drag. Okay? So when we click one of these things, I want to segue to a face that shows the diagnosis based on what you saw in your dreams. So we do this just with control drag. So let's control drag from Golden Bear down here. See how it's grabbing onto this MVC down here? So we'll let go. And it says, what kind of segue do you want? And we're going to do show detail because we want it to show it in the detail side of a split view. And in a navigation controller, it'll just push it. But the show detail will do the split view thing. So there we go. And look what happened there. We got this little segue. If we inspect it over here, you can see there's its identifier. You could even change what kind of segue it is in the future if you wanted. But this identifier is the Golden Bear one. I'm going to call this the sad identifier. Okay? So whenever this goes through, this identifier for this segue is called sad. And we'll do the same thing here for Dancing Tree. Okay? Show detail again. And Dancing Tree's segue, which is right here, we're going to call this one happy. That's the happy one. Now, I told you these should be verbs, so maybe this should be show happy diagnosis, show sad diagnosis. But for demo, it's less typing later. I'm just putting happy and sad. How about Buckeye? Okay, we'll say show detail. And for the Buckeye one, where is that one? That's this one, I guess. We'll say meh. Okay, not happy or sad. Okay, and you can move these things around. Right? If you're having trouble selecting them or whatever, you can move them around to get at them better. Okay? So this is what our storyboard looks like now. Let's make some more space. You can see it right here. And we've got our detail. Maybe put this up here. And we've got our master, and we've got the segues now. So let's go ahead and run and see if this works. Let's go on iPad. Okay. Oh, does not appear to work on the iPad. Oh, that's interesting. All right, let's try it on the iPhone. Oops. All right, so here's iPhone. So we're at the face. Let's go back to the master. Here's the master. Notice we have this nice title up here now, psychologist. Let's do this. Oh, it's doing something. But it's not actually showing the diagnosis, but at least it's segueing to the other one. Okay? So the iPad was working too. It's just there was nothing to see because the detail was there was already a detail there, and it replaced that detail with a new one. But we didn't prepare that thing, so it doesn't know how much to smile. It doesn't know how to show the diagnosis because we had to prepare it. Okay, so preparing is the next step. We do the preparation for these segues in this view controller. This is the view controller that's instigating the segue. So here's where we have to put our preparation. This is the psychologist view controller. Okay, so we're going to go over here to our psychologist view controller code. Delete that stuff. Okay, here's psychologist view controller. And all we have to do here is implement that one prepare method. Okay, so it's called prepare for segue. Okay, I'll let it type it out for me if hitting tab. And you can see there's the two arguments, the segue and the sender. Now, I'm going to just say here, if the segue's destination view controller, sorry, I can say if I can let HVC, happiness view controller, equal the destination view controller as a happiness view controller, then I'm going to do something based on what the identifier is. Now, if this segue, if we have a prepare for segue and we're segueing to something that's not a happiness view controller, then this if let is not going to happen. So none of what I'm going to type right here is going to happen, and that's perfectly fine. You can kind of do the if let on what kind of thing you're segueing to, or on the identifier, one on the outside, one on the inside. Kind of depends on what's going on. But in this case, I'm going to do the if let for my destination view controller on the outside, and then I'm going to do the if let on the identifier on the inside. Okay, so if I had a segue to a happiness controller that had no identifier set, then we wouldn't do nothing. But if it's set, we're going to go in here, we'll switch on it. So let's switch on identifier. If it is the sad identifier, okay, the sad segue, then let's set our HVC's happiness to 0. Okay, so here's where I'm preparing this newly created happiness view controller to be displayed on screen. Okay, and if it's the happy segue, then we'll set the happiness to 100. And then actually for anything else, I'm just going to set the happiness to 50. Okay, something in the middle. Okay, so that's it. That's all I have to do here. That's all my view controller needs to be prepared. You know, if I had other things in here, I could set other properties, but this is all this one needs. Okay, so it's prepared. So let's go ahead and run this. This should all work, right? Should be no problems. Okay, here's our psychologist. Let's try dancing tree. Oh, crashed our program. I kind of told you I was going to do this. Why did our program crash? Well, it says unexpected. I'm looking in the console down here. You should always look in the console when it crashes. Okay, first place you want to look. This says unexpected found nil while unwrapping an optional. Okay, so I accessed some optional that was nil. So that's bad. Where did I do that? Right here in Update UI in Happiness View Controller. Happiness View Controller Update UI. Well, let's see what in this line might be nil. Well, of course, it's the only thing that could be nil, which is the face view is nil. What is the face view? It's this outlet right here. Okay. We can also, by the way, go over here and find out how we got here. So we got here because someone was setting our model into the property observer. We wanted to update UI. And we got there from preparation. So here we are preparing. We're trying to prepare this new MVC. And it sets the model to be something. That updates the UI. And we get here and we crash. And why is face view nil right there? Because as I said in red, when you're preparing, the outlets have not been set. So this face view outlet down here has not been set. So, you know, it's an implicit unwrapped optional, but it's still an optional, and it has not been set yet. Okay, so how are we going to get around this? Well, luckily in our case, whenever we set, if we set our model and we try to update the UI and the face view is not even connected yet, well, we can just ignore it then, because obviously the face view is up to date because it's not even hooked up. So we can just use optional chaining here and just put a question mark there, right? And what that says, if this thing is nil, then just ignore the rest of this statement. Okay, so one thing you probably end up doing a lot of times is in the things that could be called from a prepare, you might be putting this optional chaining in or checking if face view does not equal nil, then do something. Okay, so that should fix that. Let's go ahead and run this. Here it is. Let's go back. Dancing tree, very happy. Golden bear, very unhappy. Buckeye, okay, working fine. Let's go take a look, and let's go look in landscape here, golden bear, working fine. Notice that this MVC underlaps this title bar up here. You can actually control that in the storyboard. If you inspect the MVC, you can click on there, say do not go under thing on the above me. Also notice that in landscape you get a little smaller title bar up here, which is kind of nice. Okay. But back in here you get the bigger one because you're getting the carrier and the time up here. Okay, let's go look at it on the iPad. Okay, here's this. I can slide this thing out from the right. Golden bear, dancing tree, Buckeye, working great. We can go over here. Golden bear, dancing tree, Buckeye. Okay? So pretty straightforward. This stuff is all pretty easy to visualize in your storyboard. When you're looking at the storyboard, it's pretty clear once you understand how these connections happen to see what's going on over here. Okay, so one other thing I want to do here is let me go back to my simulator. Look at this guy over here. This guy doesn't get a title. That's kind of a bummer that he doesn't get a title right there. And he does on the iPhone, right? If you remember the iPhone, he had a title. It was blank, but he had a title. So I want to give this guy a title on the iPad as well. So I'm going to do that by just selecting it here and saying embed in a navigation controller. So I put this guy in a navigation controller too down here. Okay? So then I can have a title. Now, I could click here to set the title right here. I could say diagnosis or something like that. But actually, I'm going to have the title be set in code. What I'm going to do is every time someone sets my model in my happiness view controller, when I update the UI, I'm going to say my title equals my happiness. So I'm just going to put that integer, which is my happiness, as my title. So I'm going to put that in here. Let's see if that works. So we run. I've got a title. Doesn't look like I've got there, but no one has set my happiness yet, so that makes sense. Oh, but it looks like I've broken something by doing that. This doesn't work. Huh? Why doesn't this work? Well, the reason this doesn't work is because these segues are segueing now to a navigation controller. They're not segueing directly to a happiness view controller. So this prepare that we have right here, this very first line is going to not work because the destination view controller is no longer a happiness controller. It's a navigation controller. Everyone understand that? So how can we deal with that? Well, that's actually quite easy to deal with. I'm going to create a variable here called destination, which I'm going to set equal to the destination view controller as a UI view controller, because I know it's a UI view controller of some sort. And then I'm going to say, if I can let navcon equal the destination as a UI navigation controller, okay, then I'm going to set the destination to be the navcons, and what I want is the visible view controller, the one on the top of the stack, right? So I'm going to say, whoops, dot visible view controller. So that's it. Visible view controller is just a property in UI navigation controller that returns the one that's on the top of the stack, which is going to be that happiness view controller because that's the only one on the stack. Okay, and then here, instead of saying destination view controller here, I'll just say destination. So now, if we come in here, and this is the happiness view controller, in other words, I don't have the navigation controller, then this is not even going to happen. And so it's fine, this will work. Otherwise, if it's a navigation controller, I'm going to pull the happiness view controller out of it, and then this will work again. So it would work in either case. So this is nice in your prepares to make it so that if you ever think that the thing you're segueing to might be wrapped in a navigation controller, this will make it so it'll work either way. So later, if you decide to unwrap it or whatever, this will work. So let's try this. All right, so we got this. Golden Bear, there's the title, and it's working. 100. Buckeye, that's working too. Okay? Make sense there? All right, the last thing I want to show here is briefly how to do a segue in code. Because this segue we did with control dragging in the storyboard entirely. So how do we do a segue in code? So let's do a different segue here. I'm going to add another thing to this. Let's go down here and add a new button right here. Put it in here. I'm going to call this nothing. So what do I see in my dreams? Nothing. I don't see anything. Okay, and I'm going to put that here. I'm going to try reset to suggested constraints. I'm going to check to see what it did. That looks perfectly fine to me. I'm rocking. But instead of control dragging from here to make this segue, I'm just going to create a normal target action method. Okay? So this is, I'm just going to make this be a normal, completely normal button that's going to do target action from here. Okay, so let's make some space over here in our psychologist view controller. I'm going to control drag over to here. Okay, it's going to be an action. I'm going to call it the nothing action. I'm going to have the sender be a UI button and connect. So now every time I click on nothing, it's going to do this target action right here. And what I want to do inside here is cause a segue to happen. Okay? So it's basically a segue in code. So how am I going to do that? Well, I still have to create the segue in the storyboard. Okay? So I'm still going to go back here and create the segue. But the question is, where do I create the segue from? Where do I drag from, since I don't want this to directly cause it? And the answer is, I drag from this little thing up here. You see this little yellow guy? This yellow thing represents the view controller. So when you're setting up a segue that's going to be fired off in code, you do the control drag from this little yellow thing. So let's go down here. Okay. I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to control drag over to here, to this navigation controller. Sorry for the screen resolution there. It's still going to be a show detail segue. I'm going to now zoom out. Okay, let's find this thing. It's not that one, it's not that one, it's this one. And so notice that when I select this one, it's showing the whole view controller sending this. And so we'll call this the nothing segue. Okay, so now we have this segue named nothing. It's not hooked up to any button or anything like that. Okay, but if I go over to my psychologist view controller, now in nothing I can say, so let's make this nice and wide, perform segue with identifier, the nothing segue. And the sender, we could make it be the button, or we could make this actually be self, so the view controller itself could be the sender, or we could make it be nil. Okay? But this sender, whatever we put here, is just going to be passed along when we get a chance to prepare. Because this segue, even though we're executing it from code, still going to get a chance to prepare. So if we went down here and said case nothing, maybe the happiness there is not very happy, okay? Then you can still prepare down here. So even though we're doing it in code, it's still going to prepare. All right, so let's go take a look at that. Back to our iPad here. So there's happy, sad, and here's nothing. Okay? Make sense? So you can do things from code. Now, why would you ever want to do it in code? Well, maybe you want to have a button clicked, and then depending on the state of something, it'll do one segue versus doing another segue. So you can have a little if-then there that performed one of two different segues. That's a classic reason you might want to do segues in code versus just control dragging directly from the button. All right. I believe that's all I wanted to cover today on that. Yes. So now we'll go talk about popovers. So let's go back to our slides here. All right, popovers. So I don't talk about popovers with the other three because it's a little bit different. A popover is a little different. So here is a UI that has a popover in it. This is the calendar app. And you can see the popover is that whole area there where I'm searching in my calendar trying to find something. Okay, so that whole popover, that little lighter colored area in the upper right-hand corner, that is all one MVC. It's the search for appointment MVC. Okay, so, and it completely fills that popover space. Now, notice that the popover also has kind of a little arrow. You see that tiny little arrow? It's just like a little white triangle. That's pointing to whatever caused this to come up. So in this case, that little thing that looks like a magnifying glass, that's what the user must have pressed on in order to have this popover for searching come up. Right? Now, notice the rest of the screen here is gray, except for the keyboard, is gray. See, it's kind of grayed out. And it's also, if you tried to click in there, it wouldn't work. Like if you tried to click on the week button at the top, or the month button, or the year button, it wouldn't work. But what it would do is dismiss the popover. Okay? So that gray area, so you can see that it's not as bad as take over the screen, but it's still the case that I can only do what the popover is asking me to do. I can't do anything else until I dismiss the popover, but it's just really, really easy to see what the rest of what was going on before you brought the popover up, and it's really easy to get rid of the popover. Now, the interesting thing about popover, and the reason I talk about it differently, is that it's not a UI view controller. Okay, a popover is itself not a UI view controller. It's brought on screen using what's called a presentation controller. And I'm not really going to talk a lot about presentation controller, just a little bit about the popover presentation controller. But it's the underlying mechanism that all this stuff is based on. So popover doesn't really need to have a view controller whose view is this MVC. It can do it purely with the presentation controller mechanism. So let's talk about the popover then and how we make it work. Because the interesting thing about a popover that even though it's not its own MVC, it still segues and all that stuff exactly the same. You still control drag to some view controller. You still get to do prepare for segue. It all looks exactly the same because it's still doing segues. Even though it's not its own view controller, it's still using segues to cause it to appear. Okay? So things to note when you're preparing for a segue here. Okay? One is that inside your prepare, you can get a hold of what's called the presentation controller. And the presentation controller for a popover will tell you things like, what's the button that brought this popover up? And you can even configure the presentation like, I don't want this popover to pop up to the left of anything. I always want it on the right side of something. So you can even control that. And very interestingly, using the presentation controller's delegate, so this is the first time we talked about a delegate in iOS in this class, although we're going to talk about it in spades next week. Using the presentation controller's delegate, you can affect how the popover adapts to being on an iPhone. So a popover on an iPad pops up like you saw on the previous screen there, a little window that pops up. Well, on the iPhone, it adapts and instead does modal. Full screen. Okay, so it doesn't pop up as a little thing on an iPhone. And why is that? Well, the iPhone's smaller, and so if the thing you're popping up is really big, there might be no way to cram it in there and make it fit. But if you present full screen modal, it's definitely going to fit. Okay, so it automatically does this. iOS automatically does this adaptation for you, just like it automatically adapts to split view and navigation controller if you build your storyboard right. On iPhone. But using the delegate of the presentation controller, you can actually affect that adaptation. Okay? So here's a brief slide. We'll have a brief slide that talks about that in a second. But first I want to show you how in Prepare for Segue you get a hold of that popover presentation controller, and you can do something like set as delegate. So this Prepare for Segue, all the green is basically exactly the same as you would have in any other Prepare for Segue. But the yellow line there is where I am from the view controller that I'm segueing to, I'm asking it for its popover presentation controller. Okay? So this is an object, the presentation controller, that will only come back non-nil here if I'm being segued via popover. If I'm being segued some other way, like just pushing in a navigation controller or something like that, then this will come back nil, and I'm just going to ignore it because I do if let right there. But if it is popover, then I'm going to get this popover presentation controller. And if you go look in the documentation for popover presentation controller, you'll see it has some things you can configure about the presentation, like the permitted arrow directions, that little white triangle. Where is that allowed to point? What direction? And you can also set yourself, the controller, UI view controller, as the delegate of the presentation controller. Okay? So when you set yourself as the delegate, what can you do? What is it going to offer to let you do? Well, it's a number of things, but I'm going to talk about this adaptation behavior. So here's two methods that are in the protocol for the delegate there. One is called adaptive presentation style for presentation controller. Okay? So it's going to, when the popover is trying to present, it's going to ask you, how do you want me to adapt if I'm on an iPhone? Now by default, this is going to say full screen modal. But you can say UI modal presentation style none, which means don't adapt. So present it on the iPhone exactly like you do on the iPad. Okay, so for a small popover, this makes a lot of sense. Okay, and so this is how you can basically turn off that adaptation behavior. You can even go way more powerful than that. The other one here, presentation controller, view controller for adaptive presentation style, you can return a whole other MVC on the iPhone that displays your MVC in a totally different way. Maybe it's wrapped in a navigation controller, or it could be completely different. So you can really customize it. But I just wanted to show this first one because it's common to say, oh, I just have a small little popover thing. I want it to look like a popover on an iPhone, and this is how you do that. Okay? The last thing about popover that's important is the size. So you'd really like the popover to come up and be exactly the right size to fit the MVC, because your MVC might be different sizes. Okay? Even a given MVC might be different sizes. And so you really want to be able to control the size. And in a really object-oriented way, the way the system does that is it asks the MVC that is in the popover, what is your preferred size? What would you like to be? If I could grant your wish, what would you like to be? Okay? So it's because only that MVC really knows what its preferred or ideal size might be. Now, that's only a recommendation because the popover has some constraints as well, right? Because it can only appear in certain places on screen, and the screen is only so big, and those arrows, it might have to go a certain direction, they might be restricted. So the popover's got its own things to deal with, but it's going to ask the MVC it's putting inside of itself, what would you like to be? And so this is just a property in UI view controller. You can, for example, override this, okay, override the property and return your preferred size, or you can set, it's a settable property, so you could set your preferred size. If your preferred size is always an exact size, just set your preferred size to that. Or if you have to calculate your preferred size based on what your content is, which you're going to see in the demo that I'm going to show about popovers in a moment here, then you can override it, which is what I did in that demo. Okay? So we're going to have a demo here, which is adding a popover to psychologists. Popovers, I made them extra credit on your homework assignment. So you don't have to do them, but I recommend doing it because it's a good experience to make a popover. Okay? Because it is something, if I had enough kind of room in your assignment to have fit popovers, I wouldn't have made that extra credit. But I just, only giving you 1 week's worth of work, I don't want to overburden you. But this is an extra credit you really want to try to do, I think, if you can. Because in your final project, you're almost certainly going to have some reason, hopefully, to put a popover in there. Okay? Now, before I do the demo, let me talk about what's coming up, because I never get back to the slides. Friday, we are going to have that Friday section again for iTunes U people. Sorry, it's not going to be it's not video. It's not in a room that we can do the videoing, really. So that should be a good one. That's also an extra credit item in your homework, is to analyze your performance of your calculator that you're doing, your graphing calculator, and find out where it's slow. And then maybe even fix it if you want. That's another extra credit, is to try and go fix it. Next Monday, I'm going to dive into the view controller lifecycle. I hate to have had to put the view controller lifecycle off for so long. But in some ways, it's kind of nice because it forces you to use other parts of your view controller, like the property observers in your outlets and in your model setting and things like that. But you're going to find out on Monday, you're probably going to be mad at me on Monday when I show you all these nice methods in the view controller lifecycle, and you're like, oh, if you just told me that last week, it could have made something so much easier. But the homeworks are designed to not need any of the view controller lifecycle methods. You shouldn't need them for any of it, even for the extra credits, you shouldn't. And then, again, I have auto layout question mark, kind of a running joke. We'll see. Hopefully we'll get to auto layout eventually in this quarter. But like I say, see, I'm kind of sprinkling it in every demo, a little bit of auto layout. So hopefully you're learning a little bit along the way. And then after Monday, we'll start diving into multi-threading, because you're talking about a device, a phone, that needs to be highly responsive to the user. Okay? It needs to always be responding to touches. It cannot. You press a touch and then it freezes for 2 seconds or even a second while it goes off and does something. It needs to be immediately animating a response to what you're doing. So to only make that work, if you're doing things like accessing the network, which is really slow compared to the things you're doing on screen, you need to be able to do those things offline of the main thread of execution. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll start talking about scrolling, because you got this small screen. It's nice because it fits in your pocket, but if you want to show something big, you need to be able to scroll around in it. If you want to see a nice image and you want to zoom in and see a really detailed part of it, you have to be able to zoom in and scroll around. And then we're going to talk about the next big thing and the topic of your next homework after the calculator, which I know you love the calculator, but this is your last assignment for the calculator. We're going to move on to a whole thing called table view, which is really highly delegate-based user interface mechanism in iOS that really helps you understand how iOS works when it comes to its sophisticated user interface. Okay? So that's what we're going to be doing next week. All right? Thank you.
Okay, so let's continue with our psychologist demo here. We're going to add a popover. And the place I'm going to add a popover is down here, okay, in this happiness view controller here. I'm going to put a little button here. And this popover is going to show the history of all the diagnoses made by the psychologist. So the psychologist is going to be diagnosing things as we click on what we see in our dreams. And we're going to want a little button here that brings up a popover right here. And this popover is going to show the history of the diagnoses. Now, since this is a demo, we want to keep the code simple. It's going to show the history of the diagnosis just as an array of ints, because we know that our happiness is represented in ints, so it's going to show an array of ints. But it might be nicer to show it in a different way, but we're going to show it as an array of ints. So let's build this popover segue first, and then we'll have to go on to build a brand new MVC actually to show the information. It's just going to be a simple MVC that shows text only. So we'll have to do that, and then we're obviously going to prepare for this segue. But first, let's build the UI portion of this, and to do that, I need to add a little bar button here. So I'm going to bring up my object palette here, and I'm going to zoom in on this guy. And when you put a button here, you don't use this UI button. Okay, so UI buttons, even if you drag a UI button here, it'll look like it's going to work, but actually don't do that. It'll kind of mess you up. So you do not want to use the UI button. Instead, you want to go down here quite a ways towards the very bottom, and there's this bar button item. So a bar button item is a little bit lighter weight button that goes in bars like this, navigation bars and toolbars. So let's just put that one right there. We'll call this history, since it's the diagnostic history of what's going on with this patient right here. And of course, if we're going to have a popover, the popover shows an MVC, so we need to create a new MVC. So let's go back to the top here and get ourselves a brand new view controller. So this is just a regular old view controller like we've dragged out before. So I'm just going to drag that right in here and make some room. So here we have this. Let me zoom out a little so you can see it a little better. And what we want is for this little button to segue to this MVC and show it in a little popover right here. Okay, so that's all we want to do there. So let's just control drag, just like we create any other segue. We're going to control drag from this history button over to this MVC. And when we let go, it's going to say, well, what kind of segue do you want? And we want the popover presentation segue right here. So I'm going to click that. This is a popover. If I click here on the segue and go to the attributes inspector here, you can see that it is a popover segue. I can even control where the little arrow, if you remember the slide about the popover, there was a little kind of triangle that was pointing at the thing that brought it up, like this history button, or in that slide it was a little search button. So I can control which direction that arrow pointed, and I can even see here the anchor, see it highlighting there, that is going to bring up this popover. So that's great. And of course I need an identifier, just like any other segue I need an identifier. So this shows the diagnostic history, so I'm going to call this show diagnostic history. My caps lock issues there. History. There we go. Show diagnostic history. Okay, so now we've got this set up to do this segue and show this MVC. Now this MVC is just a blank MVC right now, but let's go ahead and run and see what this looks like. So this is just going to show a blank MVC at this point. So here's our iPad right here. Maybe we'll go to landscape mode. And so if I click on this, you see I get this nice blank MVC appearing right here. So our next step in this is we need to create this MVC. All right, we're going to create the MVC that is going to go in here. It's going to be a very, very, very simple little MVC. It's just going to have a text view in it here to show text, and that's all it's going to do is show text. It doesn't do anything else. Okay, so let's start by creating a new UI view controller subclass. So again, I'm going to go to iOS source Cocoa Touch class here, because I'm going to create a Cocoa Touch class, and it is going to be a UI view controller. I'm going to call it text UI view controller, because that's what it does. It shows some text. That's all this view controller knows how to do. I'm going to put it in the same place all the rest of my Swift files are. Okay, here it is. Here's the code for it. We're going to delete all this stuff in here to start. All right, so we've got a nice subclass of UI view controller. We'll have to put our implementation in here. Meanwhile, let's go back to our storyboard and make sure that we set this thing's class in the identity inspector up here to be the text view controller, so that we know this is a text view controller. Okay, now let's talk about this thing's UI. It has a very simple UI. I'm actually going to drag out a text displaying object here, and I'm not going to use label. Label is nice for 1 and 2, maybe 3 line pieces of text, static text, but I really want something that kind of can show as much diagnostic history as I wanted. So I want something that shows a lot more text. Text field is not really appropriate because that's editable 1, 2, 3 liners. So label and text field are very similar, just editable or not. But there's yet another one down here called text view right here. And this displays multiple lines of editable text. It lets you set the fonts. The text can be selectable, you can copy and paste from it, things like that. So this is a much more powerful text object. We'll talk about this later in the quarter, but for now I'm just going to drag this in right here. You notice I used the blue lines. I'm going to go up here and reset to suggested constraints. I'm going to go over here to the size inspector up here and verify that my constraints are the way I want, and they look fine. Okay, so that's good. I could also set some attributes maybe about this text view, like I probably don't want it to be editable. I don't want the diagnostic history to be actually, touched on and edited, but it's not bad to have it selectable. Someone might want to select the diagnostic history and then copy it and paste it somewhere or something like that. We could set the font to be larger too, maybe something 24 point or something like that. And of course, it's got this kind of pseudo-Latin placeholder text right here, but that's not going to matter because that's not going to show, because we're going to set the text we want when we prepare for this segue. Okay, so now let's go ahead and wire up this UI. We've got this text view right here. Let's control drag to create an outlet to it. Okay, I'm going to call that outlet text view. So we've got a nice outlet here, and let's add a model to our text view controller. My model, I'm going to call it text. It's going to be a string. It'll start out as the empty string. Okay, now every time my model gets set, I want to make sure that I update my text view's text. So text view is this thing that manages text, and you can see it has an enormous number of things you can do. It's a very powerful text object, but it also has just a simple method called text, just like UI label does. And we're going to set that equal to our text, the model's text right here. And just to be safe, in case this is being called while we're preparing, okay, we'll do the same thing with optional chaining in case our outlet here has not been set. And similarly, when our outlet finally does get set by the system, we're going to have its property observer say text view dot text equals text. Okay, and here we don't have to do the question mark because we're actually the text view is being set by the system, so we know it's set by the time this set happens. Okay, so this is a very, very simple MVC that we're using right here, and it should have no problem displaying our little diagnostic history there. Okay, so now it's time to prepare this segue. All right, we want to prepare this segue so that when you click on history, it shows the diagnostic history here. Now, we know that this instigator right here is inside this happiness view controller. So we might think that we should go to our happiness view controller right here and add the prepare in here. Okay, and we could do that, but remember that happiness view controller is something we dragged in from another app. And maybe that's another app that's being worked on at our company, or that there's another programmer who owns this particular class, and he says, no, you can't add prepare for segue to this class. It's a generic happiness showing thing. It doesn't know anything about diagnostic history. And they'd probably be right, because if we started adding things about diagnostic history to a happiness view controller, it would be kind of a diagnostic or diagnosed happiness view controller, not a happiness view controller anymore. So where are we going to put our prepare for segue then? And the answer is that we are going to actually create a subclass of happiness view controller that we can use that's going to get all the behavior of happiness view controller, plus we're going to add the ability to do the diagnostic history. Okay? So we're going to create that subclass. We're just going to go up here, new file. Again, I'm just going to create a Swift file this time. I'm going to call it diagnosed happiness view controller. Okay? Because it's just like a happiness view controller, but it's diagnosed happiness. And here it is right here. And I'm going to import UIKit because it's a UI class. And I'm just going to say that my class diagnosed happiness view controller inherits from happiness view controller. Okay, so I'm going to be a subclass of diagnosed happiness view controller. Make sense? Now, over here in my storyboard, I'm going to select this scene right here. I'm going to go to the identity inspector, and I'm going to say that this scene is no longer a happiness view controller. It is a diagnosed happiness view controller. So now I'm this guy here. Now, all my outlets that were set up will work absolutely just fine. Okay, because I'm going to inherit all the capability of a happiness view controller in my diagnosed happiness view controller subclass. In fact, what's really cool is I have a scene right here, and this scene is a diagnosed happiness view controller. But if I go up here to pick a different class, if I go back and pick my happiness view controller and see it here, you can see that it'll still show me that that's hooked up. Okay, because it knows that this is inherited, this outlet is inherited, and so that it's hooked up. So I can still go back and show my super classes from my diagnosed happiness view controller to happiness view controller and see the outlets. Okay, so this is an important thing, polymorphism of controllers here. You often might have a reusable controller and you want to add something to it for a particular storyboard or a particular use in the storyboard, and you can just create a little subclass of it and put your prepare. So what we're going to do is put our prepare right in here. Okay, so this diagnosed happiness view controller, first of all, it's going to have to keep track of the diagnosed happinesses. Okay, so we're going to add a new var to this subclass called diagnosed happiness, or diagnostic history, let's call it. Okay, it's the diagnostic history of this thing, and we're just going to keep it as an array of ints. Okay, so we've got our nice diagnostic history right there. And now let's go ahead and let's do this. Let's go here and here and here. Give ourselves some room. And let's override. Actually, we don't even have to type the override here, because if we start typing prepare for segue and tab, it's going to automatically put the override func in there for us, which is nice. We don't have to be typing this unnecessarily. So here's our prepare for segue. And So all we're going to do in this prepare for segue is prepare our text view controller, right? Because our text view controller here is what we're segueing to. So we're preparing this segue right here. So we want to prepare this MVC, which is a text view controller. Okay, so let's prepare that. And let's first of all make sure that this is the segue we're talking about here. So let's go like here, check our identifier. Let's get our identifier out of there. Let's switch on our identifier. Currently we only support this one case. I'm also going to put this case, this is something you should probably always do, which is to put the segue identifier here into some sort of constants struct. So I'm going to call this my history struct. I'm going to have, let me make sure this is private. Oops. Let's quickly here, private. Private, yes. And I'm going to have this be static let segue equal that show diagnostic history. So this is the segue identifier. Maybe we even want to call this identifier, segue identifier. That. All right. So putting this in here, it just collects all your constant strings together. And if you ever change something in your storyboard, some people might even call this struct storyboard, so that every string that's in their storyboard that has to match up here in their code is in one struct. We'll call this one history right here. Kind of debatable which way to go there. So what do we want to do when that history identifier happens? Well, if we can get our segue's destination view controller as a text view controller, because that's the only thing we know how to segue to with this segue, then we're just going to set the TVC's text equal to our diagnostic history, which I'm going to do by diagnostic history. So it's just going to show this array, this diagnostic history array, as a string, right? And of course we'll need the default break out of here. Okay, so this is it. We have this nice diagnostic history. So let's go ahead and run this and see if this is working. All right, so we go. We click here, and it seems to be working because it's showing no diagnostic history. I haven't clicked any of these, so since we added this code anyway, I haven't gotten any diagnosis, so that's good. So let's dismiss that. Here I'm going to go there, golden bear. Oh, it's not working. So why is it not working? Okay, well, we have this nice diagnostic history, but we never actually set it. Okay, it's always just empty. And so how are we going to set it, though? We are a subclass of happiness view controller. Well, we can just override our var happiness from our superclass and do a did set of our own in here. So that happiness has its own did set, and we're going to add our own did set here, which is we're going to say the diagnostic history plus equals the happiness. Okay, this you can use plus equals with an array, but you have to remember the argument has to be an array. So if you just want to add one thing, you can just wrap a little array around it here. Okay, so here it's perfectly fine to override a var from your superclass. If we go look at our superclass, happiness, it has a var and even does its own did set. So I'm overriding this var, and when I override this var and I do my own did set, it does not override or replace this did set. So it's going to do this did set, and then it's going to do this did set. So it'll do both of them. So it's a really nice feature that property observers, when you override, they don't replace the superclass's one, they add onto it. Okay, so now our diagnostic history is being added. So hopefully now when we go and look at our diagnostic history, it'll work. So here we'll go dancing tree, we'll look up here. Look at that, we got our diagnostic history. Let's go over and do golden bear. Look at that. Oh, that's kind of interesting. This is not a very good history. It's only remember the last thing I ever do. I don't know why it only remembers the last thing I ever do. That's bad. That's a bug. So why does that happen? Well, I did it this way to show you and to remind you that these segues, all of these segues that are happening here, they are always creating a new MVC. So this segue, when we click on Golden Bear Dancing Tree and it segues to this, it creates a brand new MVC. And since this is a brand new diagnosed happiness view controller, it's going to get a brand new diagnostic history, which is going to be empty. So it's constantly going to be re-entering it every time we segue. So we really need to store this diagnostic history somewhere else. We can't just have it be in a var here. And a great place to have permanent storage, of course, is in NSUser defaults. Okay, so let's change this diagnostic history. Instead of being a stored property here, let's change it to be a computed property. So I'm going to have it be an int, and it's going to become computed. So it's going to have a get and a set. And in the get and the set here, I'm going to go into user defaults. Put this diagnostic history into user defaults and out of user defaults. Since I'm going to be using user defaults, I'm just going to create a little private let called defaults, which is just going to be the NSUser defaults standard user defaults. You remember this is the shared version of NSUser defaults that we get. The whole app is going to be sharing this and using it to read and write from NSUser defaults. Okay, which is nice. It's convenience to have this. It makes code a little more readable to have this be repeated everywhere versus just this little short thing right here. All right, so how am I going to get the defaults and set the defaults? Well, let's do set first. Once we set, maybe it's a little easier to imagine our get. So I'm just going to go to the defaults. I'm going to set an object, and remember that this is any object, but it has to be a property list. Okay, but luckily an array of ints, which is what our diagnostic history is. Oh, sorry, this is an array of ints. There. This diagnostic history is an array of ints. That is a property list, so luckily we can do that. And here we're in the setting case, so we're just going to put our new value here, right? So that's going to be an array of ints, the new value. For key, and so we need a key. So let's go back down to our constants here and add another one, and this is going to be called our defaults key for the history. And we can really put anything we want in here, any name for the key, but remember that defaults is a database that's shared in our entire application. So we might want to kind of namespace it a little bit by saying diagnosed happiness view controller dot history or something like that. So this is just a naming convention to throw the name of the view controller or the name of the class in general that is writing to the default in front. You don't have to do this. This is purely something you just want to be consistent with in your whole application, how you divide up this namespace for the defaults, because this is a global namespace inside your application. So this will be our history defaults key, right? So that's going to write our, anytime we set this diagnostic history, it's going to write it out to user defaults. And similarly, we can get it out by just returning defaults.object for key. Same thing, this history.defaults key. But one thing I want to make sure of is that it's always an array of int. So I'm going to do as array of int. And if that returns nil, then I'm going to return an empty array. Okay, so if I've never saved the diagnostic history to the defaults, for example, then this is going to come back nil. Okay, because I never have saved it before. So we'll start out with a nice empty array in that case. Okay, and also if somehow some junk had gotten written here that wasn't an array of ints for some reason, then this would also be nil, and we would start out with a fresh array. That would be kind of a weird case, but anyway, so you can see a simple way here to read and write from defaults. Okay, that makes sense. All right, so now let's go run our app and see if this fixed our problem of our defaults not lying around. So let's see, golden bear, dancing tree, buckeye, put a whole bunch in there. In history, it's remembering them all. Okay, golden bear, 0, dancing tree, 100. Okay, so that looks quite awesome. All right, let's try one other thing here. Let's go try running this on an iPhone. Let's see how this looks on the iPhone. Got our great new feature here, and we will see what it looks like. All right, so we got a thing, a golden bear, we got the dancing tree, we got the buckeye. Okay, let's see that history. Whoa, that looks really, really bad. Okay, so it didn't put up the history in a little popover like that. It took over the whole screen. Modal, this is what a modal segue looks like. And it put it up here, and it's smashed into my carrier thing up here. And there's no way to get out of here. There's no done button or dismiss or something, because in a popover we don't need to dismiss because you just click on the background. So, you know, this is a small amount of information. I really could have put it in a popover there. Why did iOS adapt that popover for the iPhone and put it huge screen? Well, because it doesn't really know how big this is going to be, how much data is going to be drawn or whatever until it's being displayed. And so on an iPhone, to be safe, it always adapts popovers to make them full screen presentation like this, take over the screen. Okay, but in this case, we don't actually want that. We don't want this adaptation behavior. We want to prevent this adaptation behavior so that it just keeps putting it in its nice little popover, because that was perfectly fine on iPad and it'll be perfectly fine for iPhone. So how do we prevent this adaptation behavior from happening? To do that, we need to get at that popover presentation controller I was talking to you about in the slides. And it's pretty easy to get a hold of it inside our prepare. So here's our prepare in our diagnosed happiness view controller right here. The same place down here where we're doing the preparation happening. We can also say if we can let PPC, I'll call it, equal the text view controller's popover presentation controller. Okay, so this is a method in UI view controller, and it'll return nil if you're not currently in the process of being presented in a popover. So if this segue, if we change this segue to segue somehow else other than a popover, maybe we wanted to go full modal for some reason, or we decided to push it on a navigation stack or whatever, then this would return nil, and so nothing that I'm going to do right here would even happen. Okay. So what am I going to do? I'm just going to set the popover presentation controller's delegate to myself. And that's because this popover controller's delegate allows you to have someone else control the way the presentation works. And this is the first time you're seeing the, the idea of a delegate in action in iOS. Now you remember when we set ourselves as a delegate, you can see there's an error right here. It says diagnosed happiness view controller does not conform to this protocol UI popover presentation controller delegate. And that's true, because up here we have to say that we are a UI popover presentation controller delegate. Okay, and now once we put this on here, we have to go down here and actually implement that method, and the method we want. And this method that we want is called adaptive presentation style for presentation controller. Okay, and this is basically saying here's a popover controller. So this is the, you know how in a delegate method we usually pass along the thing that's doing the delegation. So this is that same popover presentation controller being passed back to us, and it's saying please return a presentation style that you want when you're adapting on the iPhone. So I'm going to return the UI modal presentation style none, which means don't adapt. Okay, do not, when you're on iPhone, do no adaptation. Just do what you normally do, which is put the popover in a little window. And that's it. That's all you need to do to suppress that. Now, by the way, in addition to PPC delegate inside here, there are other methods in popover presentation controller you can go take a look at, and they will show you, you know, things that you can find out about what's going on with the popover. But setting its delegate so that you can control the adaptation is a popular thing to want to do. All right, so let's go try it now on the iPhone again. Here we go. Let's hit history, and now it's working. Okay, coming up in the popover here. Let's go add history. Let's go another dancing tree over here. Now we have dancing tree added there. Okay, and it'll work fine, landscape or portrait. Okay, questions about that? All right, the last thing I want to do with the popover is when we ran this popover here, you notice that it's kind of big. It's kind of covering the whole smiley face for no reason, because it really only needs to be big enough to hold that. Well, that's because really, again, the popover presentation controller really has no idea how big this information is in here, but there is a way to tell it. And if you think about who knows what the size of this is best, well, it's the text view controller, because the text view controller is the one who's going to display this. It knows what its preferred size would be. So as we were talking about in the slides, let's go ahead and make it so the text view controller reports its preferred size. So I'm going to go over here to the text view controller. Okay. Now the preferred size is just a var in UI view controller. So the text view controller could set that somewhere. It could just say preferred content size equals something. But since this is a subclass UI view controller, and the content size would change every time this is changing, and also might change depending on how big a space the popover is being popped into, we can actually do better here by overriding the var preferred content size, which is a CG size. And I'm going to override it and do the get set. Okay, so this is going to be a computed property, get and set. And on the setting side of this, if someone sets the preferred content size, I'm just going to let my superclass preferred content size do its thing. Okay, we'll just let the new value do that. So I'm going to let my superclass handle if someone sets it. All right, but if someone tries to get it, then if my text view has been set, so if this outlet has been set, and if I'm in the middle of being presented on screen, okay, then I can ask the text view what its preferred size would be. Okay, so we're going to let the text view do the work here. So what does that look like? So we might say, for example here, if text view does not equal nil, oops, I got sticky keys on here so you see that in the lower corner there. A text view doesn't equal nil, and if we're being presented right now. And so how can we find that out? Well, UI view controller has another great var called presenting view controller. Okay, the presenting view controller is the view controller that is currently presenting you via some sort of segue. So in the popover case, it's going to be that diagnosed happiness view controller is going to be presenting me. But whoever it is, I can check to make sure that's not nil. So this is only going to happen right here in the case where I'm in the middle of a presentation. Okay, also my text view is not to be nil. It's not clear I need to really set this because probably my outlets are all going to be set before this gets set, but just to be safe, I'll set both of these things. And in this case, I'm going to let the text view tell me a size that fits inside my presenting view controller's views bounds.size. Okay, and this, of course, we will need to unwrap, but it's okay because we check to make sure it's not nil first. Okay, so this is the bounds.size of our presenting view controller. So in the diagnosed happiness view controller case, it's the whole scene basically. And we're just going to see what is a good size that fits. Now, this is only a preferred content size. So if this size that fits were really huge, for example, the popover is still going to limit the size to whatever its restrictions are. Okay, so we're just preferred. This is not actual content size, it's just preferred. Now, what if we're not in the middle of presenting right here? Well, then once again, I'm going to let my superclass do the work here. So whatever it would normally return, I'm going to have it return. So remember, I'm overriding this for my superclass. So really, I'm just getting involved in this one case where I happen to be in the middle of presenting something. Then I pretty much know what my size is based on my text view. Okay, so let's run and see how that fixes it. All right, so here we go. Let's look at our history. Excellent, it fits it. Now notice also our history was remembered even after we quit our app and run it again because we're using defaults, which user defaults remembers things from quits. So here we got 0, 100, 50, 100. Let's go back over here and do nothing. 25, looks good. Let's go back and do golden bear, 0, so it's working beautifully there. Okay, again, works no matter which size we go on there, and it'll also work on the iPad as well. Oops, there we go. Okay, so there's a history, so it's up there. There too. Okay, so that's it for popovers, but we also managed to cover a couple other things there along the way. Most notably was the polymorphism of view controllers. And we were in our storyboard here we ended up actually creating a subclass, Diagnosed Happiness View Controller here, to add some more functionality. Okay, and that is not an edge case. That's a common thing to want to do. You have some reusable happiness view controller or something like a happiness view controller, and you want to use it, but you need to add something to it and you don't want to change it. Well, that's exactly what object-oriented programming is for. You can create a subclass of it and add the methods that you want to add to it. So we have here diagnosed. And what's kind of nice too is Diagnosed View Controller contains all the stuff that has to do with the diagnostic business and nothing else. So this is a very nice class, well contained, only has the diagnostic stuff in it. Okay, so that's it. And you don't need this for your homework per se, but there is an extra credit item to add a popover, so hopefully you'll decide to tackle that.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.